I think that the legal system is being weaponized to get Donald Trump. Not just to get Donald Trump, but to get pro-lifers and Trump supporters and so forth. We've seen things in this country for the past few years that we've never seen before. We've seen a distinguished legal scholar suddenly stopped by the FBI, searched, and his cell phone taken away from him. We've seen pro-life demonstrators prosecuted under federal law after local law enforcement decided that there was no case. We've seen people deplatformed for their political views. This is really uncharted territory.
Can he still be prosecuted while he's president?
That is something that's ultimately never been decided, but I think that the consensus is that prosecution would be held off, would be put in abeyance during the period he is president. No judge is going to sentence the president of the United States to prison. It's just not going to happen.
College campuses are erupting. Is it organized? Could it be organized crime? We'll talk to Rob Natelson about that. But first, like and subscribe to this channel. Click on that little bell icon, get notifications. And you can find the audio of this show on podcast. Yeah, just look for your favorite platform. All right, Rob. First of all, Donald Trump, will he be found innocent or guilty?
Yes. It will either be innocent or guilty.
All right.
The real interesting question I get, though, John, is if he's found guilty, does that disqualify him for the presidency? And the answer to that one is no.
Tell me why. Because if he is found guilty of a crime, this is not a civil case.
Yeah.
This is not the other cases where he's lost and supposed to pay damages in a civil suit. This is a criminal case, which means he will be a felon. And how can a felon become president?
The qualifications for president are outlined in the Constitution. And the U.S. Supreme Court has held that they are the exclusive qualifications, that neither states nor Congress can add additional qualifications. So if President Trump meets the qualifications, natural-born citizen, and so forth.
You have to be a natural-born citizen. You have to be over 35 years old.
That's right. That's right. Resident in the United States for 14 years. So that means that he's qualified for president. There are state offices for which states can say, you know, if you've been convicted of a crime, you can't serve. But that's not true of Congress, nor is it true of the presidency.
Right, so we're watching this trial, and it's not like I'm rooting for Trump here, but I can't help but feel that this is a political show trial to keep him gummed up during a campaign. I know you don't have a crystal ball. Will he be found guilty? Give me your best shot.
I really have no idea, but I agree with you. There are show trial evidences of show trials. The January 6th committee, recall that? Mm-hmm. The investigation into the Capitol with an attempt to tie Trump to that. That was a show trial. The impeachment proceedings are show trials.
Your definition of a show trial is the outcome is baked in.
It's baked in, and its purpose is really to influence public opinion.
It's to propagandize.
That's right. The term basically comes from Stalinist Russia, and it's alarming that that's happening in the United States, but it sure looks like it is.
Let me challenge that. There are charges that he is fighting off. I have a hard time seeing that he will be found guilty. Why? Because he pays off some woman he slept with to stay quiet. You know, stop the presses. I am sure this is the first time in American history some rich politician has paid off a former lover to stay quiet.
Well, the allegation here is that he did not properly report campaign expenditures. And the payment is supposedly a campaign expenditure, unreported. The problem with that is I gather that the reporting decisions are made actually after he was elected. So was this a campaign expenditure?
Well, here's
kind
the
of a
other part of it.
stretch.
How do they prove it's a campaign expenditure when most married guys really don't want it to be known publicly that they're sleeping around?
Well, right. I mean,
and that you can say, "Hey, I got a wife, I got a kid."
That's right.
How do they prove it was for this and not for that?
It's a very good question, and that is his defense. His defense is he didn't want to lower his family's esteem for him. He didn't want to drag them in. And let's remember also that he denies having an affair with Stormy Daniels. She's not exactly the most credible witness. So
Neither is Trump. I think she might be more credible as far as telling the truth than Trump.
Well, I don't know about that. Let's just say that if the defendant were anyone but Donald Trump, I doubt that this case would be brought.
Why do you say that? Be more precise. Why do you say that?
Well, simply because I think that the legal system is being weaponized to get Donald Trump. Not just to get Donald Trump, but to get pro-lifers and Trump supporters and so forth. We've seen things in this country for the past few years that we've never seen before. We've seen a distinguished legal scholar suddenly stopped by the FBI, searched, and his cell phone taken away from him. We've seen pro-life demonstrators prosecuted under federal law after local law enforcement decided that there was no case. We've seen people deplatformed for their political views. This is really uncharted territory in this country. The only possible analogy I could think of was the effort by some southern states to censor abolitionist propaganda in the years before the years before the Civil War. But other than that, I can't think of this kind of organized campaign using a legal system against a political candidate or a political cause.
I've read polling, and it's just polling, that says if he's convicted of a crime, not a civil issue, that his numbers drop hugely. They drop hugely. I have a feeling the New York case isn't going to go where the New Yorkers want it to go. The Mar-a-Lago case, where the guy's actually holding up files that say secret files, that one has a possibility of sticking. I just don't think they're going to get to it in time before the election. So my question to you is, let's say he wins. That second criminal case, Mar-a-Lago, he's got files he shouldn't have. Can he still be prosecuted while he's president?
That is something that's ultimately never been decided, but I think that the consensus is that prosecution would be held off, would be put in abeyance during the period he is president. No judge is going to sentence the president of the United States to prison. It's just not going to happen. It's going to be viewed as an improper infringement on the prerogatives of the executive branch. One of the reasons this is so difficult, John, is that in many ways the presidency was modeled by the founding fathers on the English crown. But the president is not a king. The president is a Republican magistrate, Republican small r. So you've got this tension in constitutional law over the issue of, well, if he's a Republican magistrate, people ought to proceed against him like anyone else, including putting him in prison. And that's in tension with the view that, he's chief executive of the United States. We have an impeachment proceeding. Maybe he's not prosecutable without a prior impeachment proceeding. So this is an area of constitutional law which is really uncharted territory.
I wonder. The political question is: the more they attack him, are they really going to push him into office? And if he loses, does the prosecution continue? I mean, do they just keep going after him and going after him? What have we ever seen a candidate or a president have this kind of problem, legal problem?
Well, let me just put it.
I remember Nixon. Barely remember Nixon. This is something completely different.
Actually, this is something that I have a great deal of personal experience with. As you know, I was very active in in Montana politics. And they went after me in all sorts of ways. Now, they had a good deal less on me. They didn't try to accuse me of criminal behavior.
So who was the porn star that you paid off?
Right. There was no porn star, but there were audits by the Revenue Department. There were lawsuits against me. There were all sorts of personal attacks, both in the press and personal threats and so forth. In Montana politics, I was the same kind of challenge to the establishment that Donald Trump was. So I've been through that. The only difference is that they had less on me than I think that they have on Donald Trump. And so I was able ultimately to get through it. But these folks, meaning the folks who oppose people like Trump or oppose people like Natelson, are relentless and they're vicious. And they probably will give up once the person is no longer a threat. After I lost my second race for governor, they stopped going after me, for the most part.
Lay down and die. Hey, we're talking about states. You were in the state of Montana. You do a lot of work there still. You were a professor.
Yes.
At University of Montana. So not only did you do a lot of protesting when you were a kid, I remember the stories of you taking over the chancellor's office and all the rest, but you must have seen protests while you were at MU anyway. Look at what's going on right now. I remember protests at CU when I went there. It's the same kind of silliness. There's this passion for it. You have an idea that maybe this is more organized than we think.
Oh, it's definitely more organized. I mean, let's start with a protest that occurred when I was in law school. A building was taken over called Carpenter Hall in 1972. It was taken over for quite an extensive period of time. I actually knew the people who were the leaders of it. I still have in my possession copies of notes taken by one of them at a conference a few months earlier in Montreal, sponsored by the North Vietnamese communists, basically to gin these kids up and to encourage them to do what they did. Look, we have to distinguish two kinds of protests, okay? There are protests like those that were run by the Tea Party. Protests run by the Tea Party were, you hire a hall or you get a permit, you gather, you listen to a bunch of speeches, you shout your approval or disapproval, you carry around signs, and then you go home and you write your congressman and the newspaper, and that's it. That's a traditional American protest, again exemplified by the Tea Party. And by the way,
other than January 6th, we've never seen Tea Party type folks try to take over a building, shut down streets, shut down services.
In fact, the Tea Party people generally would clean up their own mess before they went home. Take home their folding chairs.
I spoke at a Tea Party rally, a few of them. One at the Capitol. There was like 8,000 people there, and these sweet ladies came. I've never been to one of these before. What am I supposed to do?
Yeah.
And I talked to one of the cops who was there, and he said, "I've never seen this. The people who are protesting clean up their own messes."
Yeah.
He said, He said, "I could handle these protests all day."
Yeah, of course. Now, the protests that we've seen on the left, not every one of them, but recurrently, really since the Watts riots of 1968, are quite different. They almost always involve some sort of law breaking. It may be simple trespass or littering, or as in the case of the Black Lives Matter riots, arson, perhaps even homicide. And so I wrote a column for the Epoch Times saying, it's okay if we take the kid who's trespassing and put him in the clink for a few days. But what we really need to do is we need to go after the people who are organizing these protests, not organizing the protests per se, but organizing protests that are designed to turn into illegality. Now, at the federal level, that means using a law called the Racketeer Influence and Corrupt Organizations Act, popularly known as RICO.
So I've heard the term.
And that's,
we're going to use RICO on this guy. One more time. Racketeer
Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act.
This was to go after mobs.
Or anyone who is engaged in serial conspiracies in order to bring about certain serious crimes like arson. So in the case of the pro-Hamas demonstrations, I'm not sure RICO would be appropriate because we haven't seen crimes rising to the level of arson. But we also have state conspiracy statutes. And the one, for example, in Colorado says essentially, if you agree with other people and work toward the commission of a crime, any crime, then you're guilty of conspiracy to commit a crime. So to the extent that we've got people out there who are organizing takeovers of buildings, vandalism, and so forth, I think that the prosecutors ought to investigate not just the kids who are doing the trespassing, but the people who are actually organizing and financing this. The New York Post recently had a story on the ways in which outside organizations are facilitating these protests, providing them with food, for example, funding the organizations that help organize the protests and so forth. Again, I'm not talking about squelching free speech here. I'm talking about squelching this recurrent illegal activity.
Let me bring it back to when you said you were a kid in college, that they took over a building. I joke that you did it, but I just don't see you as the type.
No, you know what I did?
What?
They were burning the American flag. And on an impulse, I ran into the mob. There must have been 250, 300 people around, to grab the American flag to rescue it. And I got right to it, and someone shouted, "There's gasoline on the flag." And they were playing with the gasoline at that part. And actually, the protesters ultimately pulled me away from it, not just to save not just to permit the flag to burn, but also to save me from being burned up by gasoline. It was a kind of impulsive conduct that I engage in sometimes when my dander's up.
You said that the people who organized it went to a conference. The conference was sponsored by
the North Vietnamese. Yeah.
This is fact.
This is fact.
All right.
This is fact.
So in the same way, now in 2024, the coordination, who's coordinating this? Who, if that was the Northern Vietnamese, who is doing it today?
Well, it's a good question. I mean, the New York Post identified some organizations, Palestinian support organizations that it believes were engaged in promoting the demonstrations. The New York Post pointed out that two of these organizations are funded in part by George Soros. One of the things that surprises me is we know so little about it, precisely because there have not been the kind of prosecutorial investigations that I think there should be. My hope is that some state prosecutors in particular get on this. At least we're entitled to know the truth. Why is it that at critical moments in the political cycle, suddenly campuses erupt, streets erupt, everybody gets the same idea to protest in the same way in widely distributed geographic locations? This looks a little bit too convenient to be accidental.
I think it'd be a hard thing to prove, even if Soros gave money to pro-Islamic organizations, and they had conferences and they brought kids in from around the country and they went back. It would be a hard thing to prove it all the way back to. Well, yeah,
it would be hard because you'd have to demonstrate the conspiracy. That is to say, that the goal was to create illegal activity. In other words, not just to organize kids to demonstrate in favor of Hamas, but actually to organize them to trespass on campus property or to take over buildings and so forth. I'm just saying that perhaps it's time we do the investigation. It may be that we cannot actually demonstrate conspiracy in the legal sense, but I think that's.
But to ask the questions and
find out what's going on exactly. Yeah. I mean, for example, take the Black Lives Matter riots. Why did they happen at that time? Well, you could deduce why they might have happened. President Trump is running for re-election. Early in 2020, polls come out showing that President Trump is polling unusually well among African American males. Right?
As he is right now.
Yes. So the question then becomes, if you're on the left, how do we drive down his numbers among African American males? Well, one way is to create an atmosphere in which African Americans feel like they're under siege and that all whites are racist and out to get them, and then suddenly Black Lives Matter springs up. Now we have another election year. Okay, we've got several swing states very much in play between Joe Biden and Donald Trump. In 4 of those states, Muslim voters are a significant voting bloc and could make the difference as to who carries the state.
Although, wouldn't somebody come back and say...
And so once again, you create a polarization type situation, which is designed to drive Muslim voters toward the Democratic Party. I'm not saying this is a matter of fact. This is admittedly speculation, John, but it is politically intelligent speculation based upon decades of politics.
The retort to that is, wait a second, the person that they're really protesting right now is a sitting president who is supporting Israel, and they're angry at that.
They are.
That this could do more damage to Biden's reelection campaign than Trump's.
It'll be do more damage to the Republicans, because one thing about the Republicans, including President Trump, is they've come out, thank goodness, foursquare for Israel. And if you're a Muslim
not
voter,
all of them. There are still populist isolationists who don't want to get involved there or in the Ukraine. And we're seeing more Republicans, fringe Republicans going, why are we doing this?
So my point here is that if you're a Muslim voter in a swing state, and you, for reasons I can't divine, have sympathy for Hamas, your choice is a Republican candidate who's foursquare for Israel versus a waffler. You're probably going to vote for the waffler.
You mentioned that states have the ability to look into this. If the feds aren't going to do this, if the FBI is not going to use RICO, that states can do this. States have powers. We forget the states were there before the federal government, that they created the federal government.
The people created the federal government, John.
Right. But via the states.
Via the states.
Right. Talk to me a little bit about immigration. I want to switch gears.
Yeah.
That the fight going on in Texas particularly, as Texas says, hey, we have a right to defend ourselves because the feds won't do it. And it seems as though the courts mostly have said, no, the feds have the right, you don't. You've done some research on this. What have you found?
Yeah, bear with me here for a second. You made an important point, and that is the states were here before the federal government. And in our constitutional system, how the Constitution works is that while the federal government is given by the people certain listed or enumerated powers, the states retain the sovereign powers that they had and got at the time of independence. Those sovereign powers are qualified somewhat by the Constitution, but they still, in large part, reside in the states. The Constitution itself, for example, recognizes the right of a state to protect itself against invasion, to engage in defensive war. That's the term that would have been used in the founding generation, defensive war. And so the argument of states like Texas is, number one, we are being invaded. Number two, under Article 4, Section 4 of the Constitution, the Guarantee Clause, the federal government has an obligation to defend us against the invasion. And number three, we have the reserve power to defend ourselves against the invasion also. My research focused on question number one and question number three. Is this in fact an invasion, this influx of illegal immigrants? Is this in fact an invasion, as the Constitution uses the term? And secondly, what are the state's obligations or prerogatives in the face of that?
Well, then let me ask you, is it an invasion?
Yes, unquestionably.
What do you mean unquestionably?
Unquestionably.
I haven't seen tanks rolling over. Right. I haven't seen bullets flying. I haven't seen uniformed guys coming through. I haven't seen bombs blowing up. This doesn't look like an invasion the way that most Americans would think of an invasion.
The word invasion today and in the founding era usually referred to a military invasion, but not invariably. The term was used more broadly than that. My co-author and I looked at 13 different founding era dictionaries for the definition of invasion, and I've since looked at another one. Every single one, with one exception, defined the term more broadly than just a military invasion to mean essentially an unauthorized intrusion. Secondly, we found instances in the literature of 18th century in which people used the term invasion to refer to unauthorized but apparently peaceful incursions. One good example. In the period before the Constitution was adopted, large numbers of Connecticut settlers moved into Pennsylvania in violation of Pennsylvania law. They were peaceful. They just took land that they thought was theirs under Connecticut law, because Connecticut had claims in Pennsylvania, and they settled there. It was a peaceful incursion. And yet the Pennsylvania legislature and Ben Franklin referred to this actually as an invasion. It was an illegal immigration by a significant number of people without authorization, and they referred to it as an invasion.
Who decides if it's an invasion? The federal court says, no. The Supreme Court says, no, that's not an invasion. But the state Supreme Court says, yeah, that's an invasion. Who legally wins?
We don't entirely know the answer to that because it depends upon whether this invasion question is justiciable or whether it's a political question.
Justiciable?
Justiciable, yeah.
What does that mean?
It means can be decided by a court. There's some evidence to suggest that this may not be something that the courts want to get involved in, and that and it's going to be up to the states and the federal government to resolve it through their tug of war. On the other hand, it's very possible the courts may get involved and decide that this is or isn't an invasion.
If a state says this is an invasion, does the federal Constitution give them the right to defend themselves?
No, the federal Constitution doesn't give the state the right to defend itself. The state has that right by reason of its reserved powers. However, one particular provision of the Constitution recognizes that right explicitly. Also,
which one is that?
It's Article 1, Section 10, Clause 3.
Which says?
Which essentially says that the states will not engage in military action except in cases of invasion or when invasion is imminent.
All right. So in the Constitution, they recognized that a state could be invaded,
yes.
In which case the state could use its militia, its National Guard, its forces on its own well before the feds could react.
And by the way, not just the National Guard. The state could institute conscription and raise its own forces. Yeah. By the way, no less an authority than John Marshall said the same thing. At the time the Constitution was being debated in Virginia, at the convention that Virginia, at the convention by which Virginia ratified the Constitution, the question came up as to whether the states could defend themselves against invasion. John Marshall was a young 30-year-old Richmond lawyer, advocate for the Constitution of the Convention, spokesman for the Constitution of the Convention. And he made a speech saying absolutely yes, that the Constitution specifically recognizes that if a state is invaded, it may use its own forces to repel that invasion.
So two things. One, definition of an invasion. Two, definition of what a state can do to defend itself. So from your point of view as a legal scholar, what Texas has been trying to do, take it themselves and put up barriers themselves, is that constitutional?
I think it depends on the action that Texas took. For example, Texas's effort to put barriers in the Rio Grande River, I think is constitutionally problematic. And the reason I say that is because the Rio Grande is a navigable river, it's an international river. It's always been recognized that the federal government has primary jurisdiction over navigable rivers under its power to regulate commerce with foreign nations and with the several states. On the other hand, putting up barriers inside Texas, passing laws against immigrants coming into Texas, taking immigrants and convincing them to be bused elsewhere, establishing a military presence on the border, I think they're all authorized. Now, let me just say, John, that there's been an outcry from the typically liberal, or I should say left-wing, legal academic establishment, law professors saying, oh, it's absolutely clear that Texas cannot do this. Texas is interfering with federal prerogatives, et cetera, et cetera. The folks who have said that almost invariably, in fact, I will say invariably, have been people who have not studied the founding era record and the record surrounding the adoption of the Constitution the way my co-author and I did. It's very clear from that record that Texas does have the full panoply of defensive powers to stem invasion if the federal government refuses to do so.
And as a final, Texas, tell me if I got this right, when they were admitted into the Union, has an exit clause that other states do not have. They were their own country for a short while.
Yeah.
And if I understand it, they can secede from the Union if they decide.
I'm not sure about that, but it's absolutely true, of course, that they were their own country between 1836 and 1945 when they joined the United States, but they're not alone. Hawaii was its own country as well, right? From 1795 all the way up to annexation by the United States in, I think, 1898. Vermont was its own country for several years. Even California was its own country for a few weeks.
That's very California.
Yeah, the so-called Bear Republic.
Yeah.
We mention this because it highlights the fact that the states retained certain reserved powers when they entered the Union. Again, they don't have to be recognized by the Constitution explicitly, but the right to defend against invasion is recognized explicitly by the Constitution.
So it's kind of like the urban myths that you get. The urban myth is Texas can leave the Union whenever they choose, and or Texas could break into other states.
Five states, the story
states.
I've heard, yeah.
And therefore, all of a sudden, go from 2 senators to 10 senators in the same area.
Maybe Texas ought to do that.
Well, if Texas leaves the Union, there's going to be a lot of us who go down there to live.
Oh, no, I don't want them to leave the Union. I'm saying maybe they ought to split into states.
Hey, you've got this book, which everyone should grab, The Original Constitution. You're on your 3rd version of this. Real quick, this is a layman's Bible for the Constitution.
Yeah, 2 things about that book. Number one, most of what you read about the Constitution seems to be driven by politics.
Right.
This was a real effort to try to be objective. What did the Constitution actually mean to Americans right after the adoption of the Bill of Rights? And we go through it clause by clause. Secondly, of course, is it's freely available either at Amazon.com, or if you're angry at Amazon, you can also pick it up at BarnesandNoble.com.
And it's not freely available. It's just easily available.
It's easily and cheaply available.
Rob, thank you so much.
Thank you, John.
If you enjoyed that conversation, by all means, click one of these other great programs. We have the best conversations with the most fascinating Coloradans. And subscribe to our channel. Just click down below and hit that little bell button too. You don't want to miss a single show.